You've clinked a glass at someone's wedding. You've poured one too many after a bad week. Somewhere tonight, a stranger is opening a bottle to celebrate something, and another is opening one to forget something else. It feels like a habit humanity invented once life got a little easier. But the oldest evidence of anyone drinking on purpose wasn't found in a house or a tavern. It was found in a grave, carved into the floor of a cave above the modern city of Haifa. So, why would people bury a drink with their dead before they had ever planted a single seed? The expected order goes like this: people settle down, start farming, and only then get around to making something to drink. In the cave above Haifa, the order comes out backwards. In 2018, a team led by Stanford archaeologist Li Lu examined 3 stone mortars carved into the floor of Rakafet Cave. The people who used them, the Natufians, had no crops and no domesticated grain, nothing planted on purpose. They were still hunting and gathering, roughly 13,000 years ago, when they left the residue of beer in the rock. The mortars sat inside a graveyard, not a kitchen. The cave held the remains of at least 29 people, buried with flowers pressed into the soil around them. Whatever the Natufians were brewing, it looks like it was meant for funerals, not for unwinding after a hard day of gathering wild grain. Danny Nadell, one of the archaeologists digging there, said it best: "The site's remains never stop surprising us, decades into the dig." His Stanford colleague, Jiajing Wang, described ancient beer as far from what people drink today. In her view, it was probably closer to a multi-ingredient porridge or a thin gruel. Whoever was brewing at Rakefet wasn't inventing something new. They were only catching up with something far older than themselves. If a story like this one scratches an itch, hit subscribe. This is only the first clue. 1,000 years after the Natufians were brewing in their cave, something much bigger went up in southeastern Turkey. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, people with no permanent homes and no farms raised stone pillars weighing more than 10 tons. They carved them with foxes, snakes, and scorpions, and arranged them into circles that took serious organized labor to build. For years, no one could explain why hunter-gatherers would bother, since raising stone that heavy usually needs a settled, fed workforce behind it. Then archaeologists found 6 massive limestone vessels at the site, some large enough to hold over 160 liters. Residue inside them tested positive for calcium oxalate, a compound that forms when grain is soaked, mashed, and left to ferment. Patrick McGovern, a biomolecular archaeologist who has spent his career chasing traces like this one, thinks beer is the likelier explanation. His reasoning is simple: bread takes grinding, kneading, and controlled heat, while beer barely takes any effort beyond patience. Soak the grain, leave it alone, and wild yeast finishes the job unassisted. Farming is usually explained as the search for reliable bread. But if people were already brewing before anyone perfected baking, the first grain fields may have been planted for a stranger reason than food. 9,000 years ago, in China's Yellow River Valley, someone was no longer guessing at fermentation. They had a recipe. At a Neolithic village called Jiahu, researchers found pottery jars holding residue from rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and wild grape. Chemical markers for tartaric acid and beeswax turned up together, meaning the drink combined a grain, a fruit, and honey on purpose. This is still the earliest chemically confirmed alcoholic drink on record anywhere. In 2005, a Delaware brewery called Dogfish Head tried recreating it from the original chemical data. The result, named Chateau Jiahu, won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival in 2009. A 9,000-year-old recipe is still winning awards. Around the same period, on the other side of the Caucasus, a site called Gadatrili Gora in Georgia told a similar story. Pottery there, dated to roughly 6,000 BCE, carried tartaric acid residue matched to grape wine. It's currently the oldest confirmed wine in the world. It was made in the same clay vessels, called cuevevri, that Georgian winemakers still use today. Whoever mixed that first batch at Jiahu and whoever pressed those first grapes in Georgia weren't fumbling around. They knew exactly which ingredients belonged together. No civilization took its drinking quite as seriously or as bureaucratically as Sumer. The Sumerians loved beer enough to invent a goddess for it, Ninkasi, a name usually translated as the lady who fills the mouth. Around 1800 BCE, an anonymous poet wrote a hymn in her honor. In places, it reads like brewing instructions: malting grain, baking it into bread, soaking it, filtering the result through a woven basket. In 1989, Fritz Maytag, founder of San Francisco's Anchor Brewing Company, tried to follow those instructions and produce the beer himself. He worked with a scholar named Solomon Katz on the translation. The finished drink was served at a brewers' conference through long straws, the way the Sumerians apparently drank it. Katz admitted afterward that certain parts of the recipe seemed wrong by modern brewing standards. A 4,000-year-old sacred poem, it turns out, makes an imperfect instruction manual. The devotion came with numbers attached too. Temple laborers received around 1.75 liters of beer a day, while senior officials pulled in roughly 5 times that. Even the dead were given a ration, on the reasoning that an afterlife was no excuse to go thirsty. By the time Hammurabi's code was carved into stone around 1754 BCE, beer had its own section of Babylonian law. Popular retellings say tavern keepers were drowned for watering down their beer, but that's not quite what the clause says. The actual crime was narrower, accepting cash instead of grain and overcharging for it. The punishment, though, was still the same river. By the time Egypt was building pyramids, beer worked less like a treat and more like a currency. Laborers at Giza received a daily beer ration, commonly cited at 4 to 5 liters, thick and low in alcohol. It functioned as much like a meal as a drink. Beer was doing several jobs at once: payment, food, medicine, and religion, all from the same cup. Egyptian myth credited the god Osiris with teaching humans how to brew in the first place. Doctors folded beer into nearly 100 remedies recorded in medical papyri, treating everything from stomach pain to infection. Wine, meanwhile, was the drink of the elite, and Egyptians labeled it with a precision that would embarrass most modern wineries. Jars sealed inside royal tombs carried the vintage year, the vineyard of origin, and the name of the winemaker responsible. One jar from Tutankhamun's tomb names its maker directly: Chief Vintner Apershop, on a sweet wine from the house of Aton. A drink credited to a god ended up prescribed by physicians a few thousand years later, bottled with better paperwork than most wines sold today. Long before there were hands to carve a mortar or seal a wine jar, there were primates picking rotten fruit off a forest floor. In the early 1990s, a biologist named Robert Dudley went to Panama to study insect flight, not monkey behavior. He kept noticing something else instead. The forest floor smelled like alcohol, and monkeys kept returning to the same rotting piles. Wild yeast ferments overripe fruit on its own, producing ethanol up to 7% of the fruit's weight. The smell, Dudley realized, was a signal worth following. It meant a fruit was ripe, sugary, and calorie-dense. Primates drawn to that smell found food faster, and survival did the rest. But if farmers didn't invent the drink, and priests only ritualized something already ancient, what's actually driving it? In 2014, a paleogeneticist named Matthew Carrigan resurrected an ancient version of a digestive enzyme called ADH4 in the lab. That craving is not a modern invention, and it was never really a cultural choice. The enzyme in your own liver that lets you process a drink is the same one that mutated in some nameless ancestor. That mutation happened 10 million years before anyone learned to speak. Every toast, every nightcap, every ritual built around a shared bottle descends from something older. Somewhere in your own genome, an ancient primate is still picking out the ripest, most fermented fruit on the tree. That's not a metaphor, it's biochemistry, inherited whole. Not every piece of this history holds up as neatly as it first sounds, though, and that's worth admitting outright. The calcium oxalate in those Turkish vessels at Göbekli Tepe could just as easily mean porridge as beer. Martin Zarnkow, the brewing scientist who ran the analysis, has said so openly. The tubs, in his assessment, might just as easily have fed workers gruel instead of getting them buzzed. The same caution applies to Egypt. The popular claim that Egyptians drank beer because Nile water was too dangerous gets repeated constantly, in documentaries and textbooks alike. Roman cooks sweetened wine and preserved food with a grape syrup called defrutum, a kitchen staple across the empire. It was boiled down slowly in lead vessels, which reacted with the fruit's own acid to produce lead acetate. Agricultural writers of the period recommended lead pots specifically, purely for the taste. Some historians in the 20th century argued this quietly poisoned the Roman elite for generations, weakening judgment and fertility across the empire. The classicist John Scarborough reviewed that argument harshly, and few historians today blame Rome's decline on its wine habits. A 2026 review of the archaeological record went further, noting that lead cooking vessels are far rarer at Roman sites than the poisoning theory requires. None of this makes the deeper story less true. Someone, tonight, will raise a glass at a wedding. Someone else will pour one to forget a bad day. Neither one is inventing anything. They're finishing something an ape started on a forest floor 10 million years before there was a species around to name the feeling. If this kind of history changes how you see your own habits, subscribe and leave a comment with the assumption you want tested next.